The Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is the longest river within the United States and the fourth longest river in the world. This river holds a special place in American history and literature and in the imagination of ordinary Americans. The Mississippi River begins in the hills of northern Minnesota near the Canadian border and flows southward about 3,700 kilometers through 10 states before draining its water and silt into the Gulf of Mexico. Traditionally, the river is viewed as a natural boundary between the eastern and western halves of the United States. Until the year 1803, the areas to the west of the Mississippi River and the areas around the mouth of the river were claimed by Spain and by France. In that year, the French Emperor Napoleon decided to sell this land to the United States of America. This sale, which is called the Louisiana Purchase, was very important for the United States. By controlling the Mississippi River, the Americans would be able to use it for transporting goods and people in this rapidly developing area. For many years, riverboats were the main method of long-distance transportation for people living near the Mississippi. Steam-powered boats with large paddle wheels that pushed the boat forward were very popular in the time before cars and airplanes. One of the famous cities along the Mississippi River is St. Louis. This city is known as the Gateway to the West. During the 19th century, St. Louis was the last large town that people would pass through on their way to a new farmland farther west. Today, St. Louis is famous for the Gateway Arch, a tall monument that welcomes people to the west. St. Louis is also known as the city where the music known as the blues began. Near the mouth of the Mississippi River is another famous city, New Orleans. In terms of the styles of buildings, New Orleans is said to be the most unusual American city because it is influenced so strongly by Spanish and French traditions. Even today, the traditional festival of Mardi Gras is celebrated in New Orleans each year. New Orleans and the surrounding areas of the state of Louisiana are famous for spicy Cajun food. This style of cooking was developed by the French-speaking settlers of Louisiana. The Mississippi River is famous in many stories of American literature. For example, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, which were written by the author Mark Twain, are both set along the Mississippi River. Today, the federal and state governments of the United States are working to preserve the natural environment along the Mississippi River. People recognize the importance of keeping this river healthy and clean. Sexual attitudes and behavior. During the past several decades, there have been major changes within most Western countries in people's attitudes towards sex and in sexual behavior. For people who have lived throughout this period, the changes have seemed quite remarkable. Until the early 20th century, people in most Western countries did not have permissive attitudes regarding sexuality. For the most part, young people were expected to wait until marriage before having sexual intercourse. Of course, some premarital sex did occur, and prostitution was not rare. However, sexual behavior was relatively restricted. As the 20th century progressed, there was a gradual trend toward liberalization of attitudes towards sex. However, this trend was greatly speeded after 1960, when the first birth control pills became available. These contraceptive pills made it possible for women to engage in sexual intercourse without much risk of an unwanted pregnancy. As a result, many women were more willing to have premarital sex than was previously the case. Also during the 60s, Western countries were reaching high levels of wealth and education. A new and very large generation of young people was approaching adulthood, and there was a mood of rebellion against traditional norms. There was an increase in the number of people who engaged in sex before marriage, and also a greater openness about such behavior. By the 1970s, sexual attitudes had become quite liberal, and many young people were quite promiscuous in their sexual behavior. However, this pattern reversed somewhat during the 1980s. There was increased concern about sexually transmitted diseases, including AIDS. Moreover, many young women had been uncomfortable with the idea of unrestricted sexual behavior. As a result, sexual attitudes became slightly more conservative during the 1980s and 1990s, although they remained much more liberal than in previous decades. In the early 21st century, most young people in Western countries begin having sex during their high school years, although some people wait until they are considerably older. Some young people are promiscuous, but most engage in monogamous relationships that typically last for a period of several months or a few years. When one relationship ends, another usually begins soon after. This pattern usually continues until marriage. After marriage, most people have sex exclusively with their spouse. However, some people do commit adultery. Sexuality has changed a great deal in recent decades. It will be very interesting to see how people's sexual attitudes and behavior will change in the future. The automobile, or car. In many ways, the automobile has been one of the most important inventions of the modern age. People have been able to travel much more freely and across much greater distances than was possible in the past. The automobile, which most people refer to as the car, has also had some harmful consequences, such as pollution and accidents. However, it is clear that life has changed profoundly as a result of the car. Modern cars are very complicated, but the basic idea of how a car works can be described briefly. When the keys are turned in the ignition of the car, this creates a spark that ignites some gasoline vapor inside a cylinder. Then, the rapid expansion of this vapor pushes against a part called a piston. The movement of the piston then causes a turning motion in a shaft that is connected to the wheels. The wheels turn and the car moves. The invention of the car and the engines used by cars happened gradually in the late 19th century, mainly in France and Germany. In the early 20th century, an American engineer named Henry Ford developed a new way of making cars. Instead of having one worker produce an entire car, he had each worker perform one part of the production of many different cars. This system was very efficient and allowed the mass production of cars. The first car to be produced in large numbers was called the Model T. The Model T Ford and other cars that were soon produced in large numbers were cheap enough that many people could afford to buy them. Many new roads were built and paved throughout North America to allow cars to be driven from town to town. People were able to travel much more easily and to visit places that had previously been difficult to reach. Some problems also came with the widespread use of cars. One of these problems was air pollution, because car engines burn gasoline, which produces poisonous exhaust fumes. Gradually, new laws and new technology have led to reductions in the air pollution that is caused by cars. Moreover, cars today are much more fuel efficient than they were in the past, requiring less gasoline to travel a given distance. However, this pollution is still a problem because of the many millions of cars that are used each day. Another problem has been car accidents, which have caused many thousands of deaths each year. During the 1960s, some journalists brought attention to the unsafe features of many cars. As a result, the safety of cars has been greatly improved. In addition, the use of seatbelts is now required by law. However, car accidents continue to be a serious problem. The future is likely to bring many interesting new changes to the car. Improvements in the safety of cars, in fuel efficiency, and in the cleanliness of car emissions are continuing to be made. Also, the increasing use of the car in economically developing countries will probably have important effects upon people's lives around the world.